My name is Mark Stoller. I am the editor of the George C. Marshall Papers and Professor Emeritus of History at the University of Vermont. Why study George Marshall? Well, let's just go through the basics of George Marshall's life. Career Army officer, Army Chief of Staff throughout all of World War II, 1939 to 1945, Special Presidential Emissary to China in an effort to avoid civil war, Secretary of State, 1947 to 1949, responsible for a host of American Cold War policies, most notably the European Recovery Program or Marshall Plan that bears his name. Then head of the American Red Cross, and then Secretary of Defense during the Korean War from September of 1950 to September of 1951. It is quite a list of accomplishments. World War II, Winston Churchill referred to Marshall as, quote, the organizer of victory. It was Marshall who was supposed to lead the Normandy invasion on D-Day, June 6, 1944. The job went instead to his protege, Dwight Eisenhower, because, as Franklin Roosevelt told Marshall, quote, I could not sleep at night with you out of the country. He is one of the most respected and revered figures in all of American history. There is a history here of selfless public service, bedrock integrity, and an ability to see the big picture that is of vital importance at all times. Marshall's career also coincided with the rise of the United States to superpower status. From the Philippine insurrection all the way down through the Korean War in every major episode, from the turn of the 19th to the 20th century until 1951, Marshall is at the center. Marshall, from the Philippine insurrection through World War I, the creation of the modern general staff of the Army, the modern school system of the Army, through World War II, the Cold War, Korea, Marshall is central in all of this. He is on General John J. Pershing's staff during World War I. He's one of the first Americans to go overseas to France. He is very active in the interwar army. Usually, he is compared to only one other general in American history, George Washington. And both of them for the same reason: denial of power, willingness to say, no, this is not what I want. Marshall consistently refused to run for office. He, when asked what his political faith was, he would say that one of his parents was a Democrat, the other was a Republican, and he said, my political faith is I am an Episcopalian. But this nonpartisan image that he had, he never even voted. And it enabled him to get bipartisan support for things that he wanted to do, both during World War II and during the Cold War. The Marshall Plan, for example, is presented by Marshall, Secretary of State to a Democratic president, but presented to a Republican Congress. And Marshall works with the Republican chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Arthur Vandenberg, to get the European Recovery Program passed. What is so important about this half century of American history, really the first half of the 20th century? Why is it vital to study that, let's say, instead of the late 18th century or the early 19th century? Well, every era is important unto itself, in its own right. What I see in this particular era, though, is dramatic and important changes in America's role in the world. America becomes a world power at this point, and eventually, by the end of this period, the world's superpower. That doesn't just happen by accident, okay? There are specific historical reasons for this incredibly rapid and total rise of the United States as really the most powerful nation the world has ever seen. In absolute terms and in relative terms, there has been nothing like this since the heyday of Rome. Um, there are numerous steps to it. It involves not just military history, it involves diplomatic history, economic history. The foundation of all of this is the economic powerhouse that the United States created in the last part of the 19th century and the first part of the 20th century. But along with this, if you look, the United States is the world's greatest economic power as early as the mid 1890s. Okay? It is not the world's greatest military power until the mid 1940s. What happens here? What is this gradual process? What are the pieces? Marshall is involved in every one of these pieces, and it is not just an even upward slope. There's this little thing called the Great Depression from 1929 really up to about 1940. What does that do? What does that mean? How does that influence policy? But the dominant fact in international relations from approximately 1900 to 1951, the years that Marshall is active, is this rise of the United States as a global superpower and the decline, really, of the European powers throughout this entire time period. Those are not the only themes, but they are major ones. Now, within the armed forces, what is going on is a managerial revolution in which Marshall will play a critical role. He is the epitome of the modern military manager, as is his protege, Dwight Eisenhower. That doesn't mean Marshall is not a commander in the traditional sense, but he excels at staff work, at organization. And his greatest monument may be the World War II Army, taking a force of 175,000 and expanding it into a force of anywhere from, depending on how you want to count, anywhere from 8 to 12 million. It's an extraordinary feat. And how that is done and what characteristics he brings to it are vitally important in understanding America's role in the world today. Marshall also had an enormous respect for a democratic society. In addition to that, Marshall always understood that war was an instrument of policy and that military policy was subordinate to foreign policy and that civil authority determined all of this. This reinforcement of the American military tradition of subordination to civil authority is vitally important as well. Marshall, throughout the two world wars, was constantly dealing with international affairs and the recognition of the inseparability of military from political factors. So that when some people said, how can he become the Secretary of State? What qualifications does he have? One of his subordinates said his entire career had been a preparation for this. During World War II, he dealt with Winston Churchill, Joseph Stalin, Chiang Kai-shek, to name just a few of the world leaders that he dealt with. He had been a diplomat as well as a soldier at a very early stage.